Hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. Today, my guest is integral philosopher Steve McIntosh, who is here to discuss the virtues, which is a philosophical concept with roots to antiquity, and which he identifies as a way forward for our polarized culture to move into a new integration. And this is an argument he expands on in his upcoming book, Developmental Politics, which is coming out in March. Steve has created an exercise for developing the virtues. It's called the Character Development Exercise, and it is on his website, culturalevolution.org. It's an internet quiz, basically. And I have taken it. I took it back in several months ago when he was just prototyping it. And I will testify that this internet test, which took about 8 minutes, has made me a better person. I think I'm more virtuous as a result of it. So in this podcast, we will encourage you to take the test in the middle, basically. But you can follow along at any rate, and there's still lots of good information. But please do take the test. It's worth it. All right, we start as I asked Steve to just give us a simple description of the exercise.
It's a form of applied philosophy that's adapted from my forthcoming book, Developmental Politics, and the book's coming out March 1st. And in the book, I have a variety of sort of technologies, if you will, or methods for raising consciousness. And one of those is this practice of developing character strengths, which is really a spiritual practice in its own right. So one of the things that I've done in anticipation of the upcoming publication of the book is take one of these methods or technologies, one of these practices that are in the book, and make an online exercise out of it. So this online exercise is now available on the Institute for Cultural Evolution's website, culturalevolution.org, and it's called Your Portrait of the Good. My plan is to give it a little bit of the background, give a quick 5-minute overview of the exercise for people who are only kind of interested in that. And we'll pause for a minute and let any of the viewers who are interested in checking it out can take the 7 minutes to do it, and then come back because we're going to discuss the philosophy behind this spiritual practice, this online spiritual practice, and the philosophy will be more interesting once you've kind of done the exercise and see how it works.
Well, let me also interject my testimonial.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So, we live around the corner from each other and see each other a good bit. And you have been writing your book, Developmental Politics, and I've been part of your discussion and reading drafts and so forth. And
you're acknowledged as really my number one sort of influence and the person who I've been able to bounce ideas off of. But really, you've participated in the creation of this book in a big way. So
wow. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm proud to. It's an amazing new way of thinking. But anyway, I did this character development exercise about 6 months ago, I would say, in some proto form. And it changed my life. And I'm not kidding. And in a permanent acquisition, it's that kind of thing where I saw myself and my relationship with other people and just what I'm doing here with a new clarity. So I was kind of blown away. So I just want to put that out there. And so tell us about it.
It wasn't just contrived, it was discovered. As when we get into the philosophy, I'll explain how through a development of this philosophy of virtues, which is a very interesting ancient philosophy that's experiencing a revival in many quarters now, when you apply the lens of integral philosophy to it, a lot of new things come alive that can't be seen at the modernist level, which is kind of where the revival of it is going. And of course, it goes way back to the traditional level. But character strengths or virtues, which is, a word like values, it has some baggage to it, but it's worth fighting for. It's worth trying to rehabilitate because it's an excellent word. I mean, it means those habits of personal excellence or states of intention toward excellence that are really an essential part of a goodness practice, right? So we'll get into that. But let me just say that I was motivated to create this exercise as part of the larger mission of the book, which is to try to make a contribution to solutions and amelioration to a significant problem that we face in America, really throughout the developed world, but specifically in America. We have this bitterly divided society, and it's freezing our politics. It's creating huge dysfunction in our government. In some ways, it led to the election of Donald Trump as our president. The extreme polarization and the culture war, he was a sort of product of that. And so growing out of this extreme hyper-polarization, this extreme animosity, the bitterly divided society that we have, growing out of that is really one of the major challenges of our age. In some ways, for me, my main political concern is climate change. I'd like to see a full court press on our politics and government and private sector on trying to create a solution to climate change that we can export to the rest of the world, right? But in order to do that, in order for our government and our politics to function effectively toward the amelioration of climate change, the main barrier to that is the hyperpolarization, right? So that climate change is a political football. It's seen as an issue of the left. And so rather than the entire society recognizing climate change is something that we should get behind, the division prevents that. So healing the division is in some ways a prerequisite problem to solve, or at least ameliorate, before we can start to effectively address climate change.
I like what you said about it's about growing out of it and growing into the next stage. And isn't it just the nature of evolution that we're going to polarize before there's a new integration?
Yeah. In other words, the differentiation is the product of growth. We've been stretched out through uneven growth. And so this is a challenge. But the very challenge itself, the solution is the emergence of another level of civilization, a more mature society. And so it's a golden opportunity. But we still have to acknowledge that there's many problematic conditions that we face. Climate change is an existential threat to the planet, to humanity. And that the negative things in this world are certainly a big part of what our obligations, our sort of ethical duties to try to make a difference towards those problems. But in the solving of those problems, sometimes it's at least one of the methods of growing up is focusing purely on the good, focusing purely on virtue, even in the face of the climatic times that we have. The focus on the good, the purity of the good, is what this exercise is about. And it's not freestanding. It's part of a larger effort to deal with the bad things in the world. It's not like we're trying to be Pollyanna or cover our eyes from the big problems. But when we drill down and we look at what's it going to take to grow out, we're going to have to evolve consciousness along many lines, right? We have to develop our worldviews. We have to develop our sense of identity. Every worldview, it's not just a matter of moving from, the center of gravity toward a more progressive worldview, because that creates other problems. In other words, we're advocating for an integral worldview that transcends and includes the culture war. And the evolution of this worldview has to occur along many lines of development in consciousness and culture. And one of these lines of development is character, right? So character strength is a line of development within consciousness. And I would say it's a trunk line. Like values, it really, your worldview, it really anchors your identity. So your character is a very much part of who you are. It's kind of what your essential integrity is, what your convictions are.
How quaint this all sounds.
It echoes traditionalism.
Yeah.
But it transcends traditionalism, as I'll explain when we get to the philosophy part, because it brings in elements which can't be seen until you get to integral philosophy, like the understanding of eros, right, or value gravity. Virtues are a key technology for harnessing value gravity, which again I'll explain. But let me just kind of give a quick overview of what this is. What are we talking about here? Okay, so we're talking about an online exercise. It takes between 7 and 14 minutes. There are 10 questions. You answer the 10 questions, and it creates this personalized chart, which is then sent to your email address, right? And this chart becomes like a practice tool for the practice of virtues or developing your character. And the way the chart is charted, the way that this portrait of the good is made, is you go through a series of questions. It first asks you your life's goal, right? That might be happiness or success or self-actualization. It gives you choices, right? And although you may want all of those, it asks you to select one as your sort of most the clearest articulation of what your life goal is.
And you're selecting from multiple choice.
Yeah, there's 6 choices for what your life goal is, right?
Yeah.
Just gets you to think about that mainly, right?
Right.
Then it asks you who your people are, who your loved ones are, who your close friends and colleagues are, and what groups you identify with. Like, I'm an American, I'm a male, I'm of English heritage, right? I grew up in California. These are sort of the groups that help define my identity.
Right.
Then it asks you, finally, what you consider to be transcendent. And that's defined with a pop-up. It's sort of anything that's more important than you. You have self-interest and you have greater than self-interest, right? So that might be the environment. It might be humanity. It might be all sentient beings, right? It might be goodness, truth, and beauty. There are all kinds of ways that we can, a person can conceive of what is more important for them, what they'd be willing to sacrifice their self-interest for. So then after you've lined up your yourself, your others, and your conceptions of transcendent, then it asks you to select. There's 7 multiple choice questions where you select a particular virtue for each of 7 positions. So let's go to an example of the portrait of the good so people can see what we're talking about. And as you can see, it's just a simple blue background. It kind of shows some motion. And in the center are 7 specific virtues that this particular portrait selects. And then there's the transcendent on the side, which can, oneness, my family, people in need, animals, planet Earth. And then there's just some names on the left. Self-transcendence has been selected as a goal for this portrait. Move to the next one. So here's another example, same exercise, same format, but a different set of 7 virtues selected. These are the classical 7 fundamental virtues, which we'll talk about in the philosophy section. But, again, there's different ideas of the other one. Previous one had oneness, maybe a non-dual conception. This has God's will, a more theistic conception. And then move to the third example. This one's more secular. Nature is transcendent, people. Humanists are, listed as my people. And these are another group of 7 potential virtues. There are 49 potential virtue choices, 7 potential choices for each of these 7 positions. And the process of determining which of these virtues, what are your highest ideals? What defines the best you can be? And so the process of selecting the virtues is a practice of virtues, because what virtues are, again, I mentioned they're states of intention, they're habits of the heart, they're commitments. And so part of it is just, memorizing these virtues, sort of committing to virtues. Really, that's why it's called a portrait of the good, because it's like a mantra. The portrait, and you can print it out and put it on your refrigerator, right? It comes as a high quality PDF. But the point of it is that it becomes an anchor to a virtues practice, because you've selected these virtues as a portrait of the best you can be. And the practices involves making the portrait reflect who you really are. So they're not just aspirations, they're actually character traits. So, who are you? You're courageous, right? Yeah. You're loving, right? You're just. You're creative. These are things that you aspire to be, but they're also virtues that you can mold yourself to be.
Yeah.
And this is this is how character is developed, and this practice, this approach to becoming a better person is thousands of years old. I mean, it's evolved in an anthropological context, so that it's not just a good idea. It runs deeply within human history. And again, when I get to the philosophy part, I'll explain the history and how it's experiencing a revival now, and what integral philosophy really adds that brings it alive at a new level.
Well, what it has done for me is, it's my own sort of fingerprint of how I'm going to do this. And it, like I said, it brought in a clarity of, okay, of these virtues, which one is the one I'm vibing with the most?
Right. Right.
And when I think of the people in my life, so I have these amorphous groups and friends and so forth, but it actually forced me to clarify who's my family, who's in the next ring. How do I feel about, the ever bigger rings? How do I identify? And in so doing this exercise itself, I saw where I did, where I didn't. I clarified to people in my life that, wait a second, these people aren't just here to annoy me. They're here because they're my family. Yeah. And I actually reoriented myself. A 5, I'm an Enneagram 5. We're very stingy with our, attention, basically.
Yeah.
And I reoriented that. That's very, very significant to me. And I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Well, in addition to just thinking about the virtues and choosing the virtues that feel right in terms of your personal commitment, the website also includes a list of 10 simple practices you can do once you've created your portrait of the good. Put it in a prominent place, talk to your friends about it over a meal.
Yeah.
Create a check-in weekly. This is what Benjamin Franklin did. By the way, he grew into a giant of history.
Yeah.
He had a lifelong virtues practice. And he made a list of his specific virtues that he was going to try to live up to. And every week he would record in his journal how he did on that virtue. So the idea of having 7 virtues that are, your selected virtues, and then thinking about which one is my strongest and which one is my weakest. And how can I develop these as strengths? What does that look like? Again, I've got 10 simple, easy everyday things you can do to use this mantra, this chart for your virtue practice to, again, make it a portrait of who you are.
Yeah, right on. Yeah.
Okay, so let me suggest then for the viewers of this podcast, you put it on pause for a second and go to culturalevolution.org, and click on the character exercise and take 7 minutes and do this test and create their portrait of the good, and then come back and listen to the philosophy behind it and why it's not just contrived, or why there's some deep currents of value energy that are animating this exercise, and why it really does work.
So culturalevolution.org, and the test is, again?
It's your portrait of the good, a character exercise.
Great.
Okay, so let's talk about the integral philosophy, sort of where this comes in, and how it's evolved. When I first encountered the philosophy of what's sometimes narrowed into the category of virtue ethics, I was sort of unimpressed. It seemed like being virtuous was very much a traditional thing, that they were sort of religious commandments from the Catholic Church, right? That you should be virtuous. And that didn't sound right to me or particularly appealing, because it was just, again, ungrounded religious commandments. But in the past couple of years, I've really come to see virtues in a new light and appreciate how the practice of this character strength development is very exciting, because it ties in with the idea of the beautiful, the true, and the good, and which has been a focus of my work for the last 30 years. So I could see how values and virtues were related, even though they concepts overlap. There are many concepts we could say that's both a value and a virtue, like justice. Values are all the things that people care about, all the things they strive to make more of, or it's a way of defining that which is desirable, that which is admirable, that which we're striving for, that which we want to see more of, right? And another way to think about it is the good, or quality. But value in the universe, quality, the good, is kind of best understood philosophically through this triad of the beautiful, the true, and the good. In other words, the good is very abstract, but it starts to come alive when you connect goodness to beauty and truth. Right? Beauty and truth are like the two legs of goodness, right? And as I argue at length in a variety of my books, these are like the most intrinsic values, right? So that while we could list hundreds of values, including love and freedom and lots of very important values that we could say are most important, There's something very special about the triad of goodness, truth, and beauty.
Well, in fact, you talk about them as having a gravitational pull.
Right. Well,
and I love that. That's always been very helpful to me, Steve.
So the way virtues fit in with this idea of the gravitational pull of value, that's what brought this alive at a new philosophical level and showed me how to create an exercise that could be powerful and that, people would be interested in doing, right? So the beautiful, the true, and the good. Let's get that slide up for a second.
All right.
Okay. This is sort of a word cloud. And it shows, the hundreds of virtue concepts that we could associate with value, or that can name different kinds of value. The good, the true, and the beautiful, in a sense, are like capstone qualities for the major dimensions of human experience, value in human experience. So, for example, goodness is the capstone quality of the moral realm, beauty of the aesthetic realm, truth of the rational, right? Even though they overlap, and there's truth that's trans-rational, and goodness that's beyond morality, and beauty, aesthetics are broader than beauty. The fact that these three values have been associated by both ancient and modern, secular and religious, there's something very special about the beautiful, the true, and the good, and sensitive thinkers throughout the centuries have continued to come back to them, recognizing them as kind of primary. And that leads to an analogy of like the primary colors, right? Just like RGB on your computer screen, or red, blue, and yellow in pigments can be mixed and matched to create all the visible colors. The beautiful, the true, and the good are like primary values from which all the other values can be derived, at least arguably, right? So the thing about the beautiful, the true, and the good is they're not just properties or concepts or qualities of a thing. They're not so much static as that when you come to understand them more deeply, more philosophically, when you practice these values, as you mentioned, you can see that they have an energetic pull, that they exhibit energetic properties, right? And this sometimes is just talked about in integral circles as eros, right? There's this pull of eros, which begins, which is first Plato in his dialogues talks about eros, and he makes a connection between libidinous sexual desire and this sort of higher form of eros, which leads from, a sexual attraction to the attraction to the finer things in life, the eternal forms, as he put it. But eros, of course, the idea has been attacked as being too metaphysical or supernatural or not in evidence. And so it's important to talk about in a minute here, but just let me say as a preview that this is not mysterious at all. It's in full evidence to anyone with a skeptical or scientific point of view, as I'll explain. It's a real feature of life, because wherever there's purpose, there's value pulling on that purpose, influencing consciousness at every level of its development.
Yeah.
So, okay, so the beautiful, the true, and the good have energetic properties, right? They behave in Evolution's Purpose, my 2012 book, I called it value gravity. But in my forthcoming book, Developmental Politics, I say value gravity is still a useful idea, but I'm moving toward the conception of it as value magnetism. Right, because the magnetic behaviors of polarities and circuit behavior, electromagnetism mirrors the behavior of value a little bit more accurately than gravity.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And we're talking about physical energy, and then we're talking about this thing value, which is not physical.
Yeah.
Right?
No, how cool is that?
But as Emerson said, I rely heavily on this quote from Emerson where he says that every natural fact is a symbol of some higher spiritual fact.
Yeah.
Right? And as above, so below. It's a cliche, right? So, but the ubiquitous natural fact of physical energy, including all its physics in the electromagnetic spectrum, is remarkably illustrative of a very similar behavior, albeit non-physical, in the realm of value, right? So value connects between poles like electricity. It moves in a circuit like electricity. And so just having a loose analogy, I don't know, you don't have to take it too literally, but a loose analogy of this thing in the universe which is influencing us, the potential for a better state of affairs.
Well, that's the big thing for me was I've thought about these things. I know that there's a history of thinking about these things, and it's philosophical, but then actually feeling the energetic analog or the energetic part of it in
Right.
my body and in the subtle realm really does just enable a hugely greater traction.
Right.
You
Right.
know,
Well, it also appreciates that why it needs to be practiced. So the beautiful, the true, or the good aren't just some static things you assent to. These are what motivate you. These are what
yes,
form you. These are what
yes.
reward you. Right. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll make this more concrete. Okay. Now here are these three values rendered as circuits. So let's start with truth there on the left. You can see I've got the arrows indicating that there's a circuit of learning and teaching, right? That's if we think about truth as a form of value energy, one of the rays of this energetic gravity. You can see that truth enters into your mind, and it makes it edifies you, it feeds you, it nourishes you with value energy like food when you learn it. But in order to learn the truth, in order to receive it fully, you need to give it out. You need to teach it, right? You can see this in the way that you never really learn something until you fully teach it to other people. That's what, taking a test in school is a way of teaching what you've learned, and it grounds it. Likewise, when you learn something that you're really excited about, you're naturally motivated to share it with others, to teach it, And then when you undertake the project of teaching somebody, teaching something, teaching a particular truth, it piques your interest in that. It makes you want to learn more of it, right? So there's a circuit, and it's circuiting of learning and teaching, which is how you practice truth.
Absolutely true. Completely my experience of it.
The same energetic practice of beauty, right? Beauty is something that you take it in by appreciating it, and you give it out by creating. Again, beauty used broadly to include all aesthetic experiences, right? And so because the beautiful and the true illuminate goodness, we can begin to see how these natural practices of taking in and giving out, which characterize both the practice of truth and the practice of beauty, have a similar circuit of practice when it comes to this value energy feature of goodness. And so the labels that I've used to talk about taking in goodness and giving out goodness are devotion and service. Right? In other words, service is a way of giving goodness to another person. Devotion is a way of letting that which you find to be, inherently good or transcendent or more important than you. Devotion is a word which evokes the idea of you appreciating it or learning it. It's coming into you. So these show you these circuits. And so if you focus on goodness, the next slide begins to connect the beautiful, the true, and the good with virtue. Okay, so we're now zeroing in on this circuit of devotion and service. And in the realm of truth, we now have, right, the educational establishment has developed all kinds of technologies for learning and teaching. We know there's different learning styles. We know what works, we don't. So we have all this, these well-developed techniques for truth, for learning and teaching. Likewise, in the realm of the arts, right, and aesthetics, we know very much what can get people to appreciate, what facilitates their creative urge. These things are well known. But in the realm of goodness, the practices or the technologies that go with the encircuiting of this goodness energy are not as well appreciated, or some of them have been lost. And that's where all these words in this word cloud come in. And these are some of the hundreds of concepts or words we could use to label virtues. Right? There are hundreds of potential virtue concepts that have been recognized down through the ages by thinkers and practitioners, and these are just some of them. But they show that these are all the ways that you can either find devotion to the good or be of service to the good.
And give a couple examples for folks that might just be listening, Steve.
Well, sure. So, in other words, one of the ways that you can be of service is you can be creative, right? Or you can be wise. Or you can be perceptive in your ability to recognize what's needed, right? So just looking at these words, you can be, sometimes being patient or humble is a best way of serving somebody, to sort of be more yin. Another way of serving is being perceptive or working to be effective at bringing value. On the devotion side, we could say that that which you trust, that which you're loyal to, that which you have faith in, these are species of your devotion. And how this relates to this virtue practice exercise will become clear as we proceed. So let's just
right on.
take that slide off for a second and go to the next slide. So just as we saw the previous slide of the word cloud of values with the beautiful, the true, and the good, here's a word cloud of virtues like we just saw within the devotion and service circuit. And these are 7 classical virtues that have been recognized since antiquity, and which I argue at length in the book are in some ways, they're the fundamental virtues. Just like we have the primary values, we have the fundamental virtues. And these are faith, love, justice, temperance, prudence, courage, and hope. And while we could use different synonyms for these words, we might substitute prudence for practical wisdom, or temperance for self-mastery, right? Or courage for determination, or faith for loyalty or openness, right? There's all kinds of different synonyms, but what makes these 7 particular virtues fundamental are that they've been recognized since antiquity, they've been validated within recent revival in academic moral philosophy, and they've most interestingly been validated through the research of positive psychology.
Okay, so faith, love, justice, temperance, prudence, courage, and hope. Love it.
These are the fundamental virtues, which if you look at, go to Wikipedia and type in 7 virtues, right? There's an article about it. And part of the reason that these virtues have come down to us is that they're part of the catechism of the Catholic Church, right? But they go back before Christianity, right? So many cultures revered virtues, right? There was, Confucius and other Chinese sages. Virtues was a sort of cornerstone of their teaching.
Sure, yeah, totally.
But our primary understanding of virtues today comes to us from the ancient Greeks, who were very concerned about human excellence. What does it mean to be excellent? And Plato mentions the virtues of his day that were common. As he didn't just make these up, these were in currency in the culture of Athens in the 4th century BC. And these were the 4 cardinal virtues of the Greeks, which are justice, temperance, prudence, and courage, right? These were later expanded on by Aristotle in his famous treatise on virtues, the Nicomachean Ethics. And he talks about virtues as each virtue is a mean between extremes, and how the group of virtues form a unity in which each virtue is necessary for the full expression of the others. They sort of work together. Aristotle would say mystical things like there's only one virtue, even though they had a numbered list, right? But the virtues were powerful, and they were carried over from ancient Greek philosophy into ancient Christianity. And one of the seminal geniuses of ancient Christianity, St. Thomas Aquinas, really did a lot of his thinking around virtues. And so he added St. Paul's virtues. They're called the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. Faith, hope, and caritas, or charity sometimes, but love's a better translation. And these were sort of consolidated into 7 virtues that were then kind of became part of the catechism of the Catholic Church, as I mentioned. But because they were so associated with religion, beginning with the emergence of modernity, there was philosophers sought a more scientific explanation for ethics, right? They didn't want to just have religious commandments to be, just. They wanted to come up with, especially Immanuel Kant, who he developed a system that's known as deontological ethics, basically a moral duty ethics. He said that the reason to be good is because of the categorical imperative, right? That if we want a better world, if we want to live in a society where people are just, then that's the reason. It's the categorical imperative for us to be just ourselves, right? Which carried a lot of weight and was the dominant philosophy of ethics for some decades. Then John Stuart Mill, likewise in the 19th century, but still part of the Enlightenment, came up with utilitarian ethics, where the duty was defined as the greatest good for the greatest number, right? But both utilitarian ethics and Kantian deontological ethics were both based on moral duties. And as the philosophy continued to evolve in the 20th century, this idea of moral duty started to be questioned as just a metaphysical commandment, right? It was ungrounded. So beginning in the 1950s, the eminent philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe wrote a very famous essay where she proposed that this idea of obligation was no longer legitimate within a philosophy of ethics. We had to jettison moral duty because it was not grounded in anything, and rather return to an Aristotelian conception of virtue as not something you do for the sake of God or for the sake of your duty. You do it because you do it for your own self-interest. You do it because you want to be an excellent human. And you do it because it leads to what Aristotle called eudaimonia, right? Which is a kind of happiness, a fulfillment that goes beyond just hedonistic pleasure. It's the happiness that comes from, having good character, right? For feeling fulfilled because you're being all you can be.
Well, that's what I want.
Yeah, right. So Anscombe, Aristotle in antiquity and Anscombe in modernity suggested that these virtues it was like, eating a healthy diet or doing a good workout. You do it because it makes you feel good and because it's what you need to do to just be healthy and whole, right? But this idea of self-interest at the same time in the 50s was being explored from another quarter, and that was by Abraham Maslow, right, who was unpacking the greater depths of human self-interest through his famous hierarchy of human needs, right? So first you're interested in, basic survival, right? Food, shelter. Then your interest shifts to, belonging needs, social needs, and self-esteem needs, and eventually to self-actualization. Now, there's lots of valid critiques of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because they don't always go sequentially. Sometimes people who are still hungry want to self-actualize or give their gift to the world. So it's, highly speculative, but nevertheless useful. And so the truth of it is sort of evident by the fact that it's still popular and helps people understand these sort of developing levels of human need. But as his theory was talked about and he worked on it more thoroughly, he began to realize, like in the 70s, right before his death, that there was a level above self-actualization, which he called self-transcendence, right? And Viktor Frankl, another psychological theorist, really picked up on this, and he really emphasized self-transcendence too. He said, if you focus on self-actualization, you'll never get there, because in order to be self-actualized, you need to give to something that's greater than yourself, right? Self-actualization, by definition in some ways, really signifies that you've served something higher or created something bigger than your own needs or your own self-importance, right? But Maslow kind of just stacked it on top. It was just like, another level in this hierarchy. But as I argue in depth in the book, which is too extensive to get into here, but part of it is that self-interest or our ultimate self-interest, which could be defined as self-actualization, and our greater than self-interest, which is self-transcendence or transcendence by itself, that these two motivating forces in our lives, they actually are an energetic polarity, right? That self-interest and greater than self-interest are a positive, interdependent value polarity, wherein the value of one is tied to the value of the other, right?
Thank you.
So some philosophers have said that, look, that your self-interest is amoral. It doesn't really count. What's really moral is when you're serving something that's transcendent, something that's bigger and more important than you.
Well, I get that.
They've denigrated self-interest. Other philosophers like Nietzsche or Ayn Rand, have talked about self-interest as being really what counts, and that, this idea of negating yourself or sacrificing yourself, that's pathological.
Yeah.
And in some ways, they're right in the sense that self-interest by itself, or this idea of greater than self-interest by itself, if they're unconnected, they can become pathological. Yes. One becomes selfish, the other becomes codependent, right? You need to focus on yourself so you can focus on others. And so they energize each other. And so I mentioned the learning and teaching and devotion and service, the value circuits of practicing the beautiful, the true, and the good. Well, a similar thing's going on with this inherent energetic polarity of self-interest. How it's a kind of the energetic properties are seen that there's these two poles that are connected energetically, and one pole, the charge, the motivational force of one pole is dependent upon its existence of its connection to the other pole, right? So if you're only interested in yourself, that can't hold its motivating charge for long, because it's that's just all there is. And if you're just interested in others and you are selfless, that can't hold its charge for long. It's got to have something in it for you. But when you understand that self-interest and greater than self-interest cohere and are interdependent, and ideally work together to reinforce each other, then you can begin to see how this relates to the practice of virtues, which we're talking about and which this exercise exemplifies.
Right on. Yeah.
Okay, so we have this polarity of self-interest and greater than self-interest. And when we connect this polarity to the fundamental virtues or something very equivalent to them, we can begin to see the system, the systemicity, if you will, of how the virtues aren't just arbitrary and they're not just sort of nice to haves. They're just a simple list. That there's actually that there's a physics of value energy, if you will, that helps explain why these virtues have been continuously returned to. I mean, it's important to say that not only were virtues, coming from the Greeks and the ancient Christians and being part of Western civilization, not only they were revived by academic moral philosophy, beginning with Anscombe, being followed by Alistair McIntyre and other important virtue ethicists, but they've also been validated from other quarters. So one of the more interesting ones is the validation of 7 fundamental virtues from positive psychology, right? So one of the founders and luminaries within positive psychology is Martin Seligman, right? And he's at the University of Pennsylvania, a staunch secularist, right? So he realized that character strengths were a cornerstone of positive psychology. So Seligman's project was to say all of psychology is focused on pathologies, right? Since Freud, we're trying to help people's neuroses and their psychosis, et cetera, which is, of course, worthy. But he wanted to say, instead of focusing on what an unhealthy, a psychologically unhealthy human looks like, let's also try to develop what a healthy psychological human looks like, and let's do it from a secular frame so that we're not bringing in traditional religious explanations of what being good is all about, right?
Right on.
He and his colleague developed a book which was published in 2004 called Character Strengths and Virtues, right, a categorization system. And they did all this social science research and discovered that there was a sort of a cross-cultural convergence around 6 broad areas of character strength. And these 6 broad areas turned out to be remarkably similar to the 7 fundamental virtues, they're handed down from antiquity. The reason they came up with 6 and not 7 is they lumped hope and faith together into a single area they called transcendence, which is a fitting name. Yep. But of course, they were embarrassed by the 7. They were embarrassed by the religiosity of it. So they wanted to secularize it. And so, making it into 6 and pretending that it was really just some, validated by social science. I mean, there's some validation. I mean, the social sciences.
You're talking about faith.
It has its limits. Well, in other words, hope and faith, those are ways of connecting with the transcendent.
Yeah, exactly.
In this next slide. So go ahead and show the next slide. Okay, here we are. The 7 virtues organized around this 7-pointed polygon, or heptagon it's called. And it shows with the gray lines in between how there's a unity of the virtues, how they're connected, right? How justice is connected to love and faith, etc. But then on the right, you can see that I've got what I'm underlying as obligations, which include transcendence and others and self. Even Aquinas, wrote that the things we do, we either do for the sake of ourselves, for the sake of others, or for the sake of God. But we needn't believe in a theistic God to recognize that there's a force, a pull, that influences almost every human, and this pull to serve something that's transcendent. And if you don't have a concept of transcendence that's spiritual, right, transcendence can be found in all kinds of other things, like the environment, like human needs, like art, right, or science, or national learning, right? Even if you don't have a religious concept, your happiness itself depends on you recognizing and connecting with something in your life that's more important than you. And so these dotted horizontal lines, there's crossover, right? Love can be for others, and it can be for the transcendent. Courage can be for other, your fear of others, your courage can protect you from that. But courage can also be focused on transcendence. So, but the point is that there's this polarity between transcendence, our greater than self-interest, and our self-interest, and that others are in the middle. In other words, that is, we connect with transcendence largely through our heroes, through the inspiration of others' creations. We serve the transcendent by serving others. So our self-interest goes through others, and transcendence comes down through the others, which I'll show in another slide. But the point for this slide is just to show that that what makes the 7 virtues a system is not so much the concepts themselves as the way they plug in to these sources of value energy, the sources that pull us from our greater than self-interest and the sources that pull us from our self-interest. In other words, self-interest is highly motivating, right?
Yep.
But so is transcendent. I mean, it's not connected to our biological urges, so
right.
it's not as strong, but it is connected to our happiness. It's connected to the cultural influence of our worldview, right? That which we consider to be sacred, however we define it, even in a secular way. And so we can begin to see that there's these twin powers of value gravity or value magnetism. So go to the next slide.
Yeah. There's a teaching in Buddhism about that there's 2 major desires that human beings have.
Right.
One is to be, and the other is to not be.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the same thing.
Sure, yeah. Well, transcendence and self-transcendence, right, is a way of being and not being. But anyway, go to the next slide. Okay. So this is very similar to the previous slide, except there's a different list of 7 virtues. And this is sort of key to understanding the exercise, right? The system is that there are virtues that connect with transcendence, that fulfill your obligations to what's greater than you. And there's virtues that fulfill your moral duty to yourself. Again, you have a moral duty to serve something greater than yourself, both for your self-interest and for your greater self. You have a duty to a basic minimum altruistic duty to others. Again, this is in your own self-interest. And you have a moral duty to yourself. How do you fulfill those? There's different words we can apply, but what makes it a system is that these words are connecting to these sources of value energy. So they're not just moral obligations, they're also a motivational, life-giving, spiritual force.
Yeah, so you're plugging into an energy source.
Right.
Yeah.
So the point is that because there are these ways to connect with what's greater than you and what's really, who the best you can be, that the practice of virtues, in a sense, creates receptor sites, right? So that is practicing the virtue of courage creates a receptor site for that kind of the energy that goes with that, right? So, Aristotle said, well, how do you practice courage, right? Well, you develop courage by being courageous, right? Even though you're, scared out of your wits, right? If you know that you expect yourself to be courageous and you're courageous despite the fact that you're afraid, that creates the habits. It creates the muscle memory in your consciousness. It creates, like I said, receptor sites or channels for the flow of this upward current of the good, right? This opposite of entropy, right? Just like entropy is pulling everything down and disintegrating everything. The reason that Eros, the opposite of entropy, is not mysterious or it's not New Age, it's that all of life is responding to it, right? That is every life, every form of life, from the most primitive cells all the way up through the higher mammals and, of course, with humanity, they are striving to survive and reproduce, right? Which is a primitive form of goodness, right? And the good of the individual animal and the good of their species, right? So in some ways, that's a little miniature exhibition of self-interest and greater self-interest. But when you get to the human level, we can feel it. We can feel our self-interest. Again, it's rooted in our biology, but it goes beyond our biology. As we evolve our consciousness, our conception of our own self-interest grows. And, even people at the lowest levels of development still have something that's more important to them, even if it's just their kids, right? Or their tribe, right? So this Eros is this value magnetism. It's a universal force because wherever we find life, we find purpose. And wherever we find purpose, we find value influencing it. Some kind of value is animating that purpose, attracting that purpose. And that's why it's not mysterious. It's an evident feature of the universe. But we're just beginning to understand it. I mean, like we didn't understand energy, it's physical energy, until the 1850s. Right, until Maxwell and Sadi Kano and the other, scientists of the, 19th century began to discover that there was a physics to energy and that it was a real thing, right?
Yeah. And
so we're now, through this integral perspective, being able to recognize that there's this natural fact of ubiquitous physical energy is a symbol or a corollary, or it shows us a lot. It can reveal the properties and the behaviors of this eros, or this value energy that animates all of life, and which is a big way of making humanity better, of raising our consciousness, because the pull is toward the transcendent itself, right? The pull of this magnetic energy is toward a higher state of affairs, right, or an improved condition. And the more you grow your consciousness, the more you can feel that gravity.
Yeah.
The more you can feel the potential for a better day, right? In other words, Whitehead himself defined evolution. Alfred North Whitehead, my favorite philosopher, he defined evolution as an increase in the capacity to experience what's intrinsically valuable.
Wow. Say that again.
That evolution can be understood as an increase in the capacity to experience what's intrinsically valuable.
Wow.
So, as the tree of life grows, animal consciousness can appreciate greater and greater value. And then with the emergence of humanity, we get a whole new level of values that we can appreciate that animals can. And as we evolve our worldviews, as the spiral is ascended, the scope of what we consider to be valuable grows. It widens.
Why would it stop?
Well, let's stop when the time is completed and the finite is evolved to its full potential. But that's another discussion. But just back to this idea of value magnetism. What practicing the virtues does is that it allows us to tune in to the various currents, this polarity of greater than self-interest and self-interest. So a poetic way of thinking about it is just as a plant develops leaves to collect energy, and to grow and thrive, that these virtues are like the leaves of our soul, right, that help us, receive the energy of value and be nourished by it.
Oh, how lovely.
Grow our characters thereby, right?
Yeah.
So this practice is again, it's a way of jumpstarting this character development exercise and the portrait of the good that it creates. Is a way of thinking about what virtues really matter, especially in the context of what you consider to be transcendent, which you listed, what you consider your ultimate life's goal, which you've listed, who your people are that you really care about.
Yeah.
And so if you'll go to the final slide, or the penultimate slide, we can see this idea of this polarity and how it relates to this practice of goodness, and how virtues are the techniques of this practice. So the gray is a polarity diagram, right? It shows the polarity of the transcendent and the polarity of the self, with the others, in the middle. As I mentioned, we receive the transcendent through the creations of others, through, that is our families transcendent. We serve, we give to the world, we give our gift, specifically by being of service to others. Again, so the energy flow is moving. This is sort of like this polarity of interests. These motivational forces in human life are in some ways the engine room of the goodness practice, right? You can see, if devotion and service is a way of channeling the energy of goodness, of practicing it, of learning it and teaching it, of appreciating it and creating it, then we can see how the motivational energy of the transcendent and our self-interest are there as the source of energy that powers or that moves this energy through us and neutrifies our consciousness.
Right on. Yeah.
Maybe you can show that final slide of the portrait, just so we can see that one more time.
Okay.
So you can begin to see how transcendence isn't just the things that you love. These are also forms of energy. They motivate you, right? Likewise, especially with faith, hope, and love. The more you develop your faith, hope, and love, the more you can connect with, the more you can receive the energy of that transcendence. Because faith, for example, faith is a technique of perception for that which is transcendent, right? This was elegantly expressed by the philosopher Blaise Pascal, who wrote that human things must be known to be loved, but divine things must be loved to be known. And really, he really gets at the point that that these virtues of faith, hope, and love, those open your heart to being devoted to, receiving the energy from, being motivated by the things which you recognize as transcendent.
Yeah. Well, and just to use a couple examples that you have up here, the transcendent being God's will,
if you're
my children,
right?
To feel the transcendence of your children,
most parents would lay down their life for their children.
Fantastic.
It transcends self-interest, right? Your children in some ways are more important than you, practicing goodness.
Yes. And humanity, the environment, democracy, America. These are the list of the transcendent on this
These
particular.
are sort of traditional ideals of transcendence, right? Yes. The other slides show more postmodern ideals of transcendence. Again, it doesn't have to be religious. It can be highly secular. But the point is that this practice can develop yourself. It's a personal spiritual practice. It can make you a better person. It's been worked out. This practice of virtues has been worked out within a living anthropological context for thousands of years. It's not just some new age bromide.
Right.
It goes way back into history, and people have. So there's a giant body of literature,
yes,
ancient and modern, analyzing why these are really what it means to live the good life. Being virtuous is a practice for being an excellent person, being happy, having eudaimonia, right? But beyond, your self-interest, beyond the sort of the personal excellence and the happiness that goes with this practice of your personalized commitments to virtue, there's a larger political significance to a virtues practice, right? Because as I explain in detail in developmental politics, values, even though we can talk about the beautiful, the true, and the good, and those are universal values, in politics, those values get translated into the specific worldviews, traditionalism, modernism, postmodernism, that people who are familiar with this podcast and integral philosophy are aware of. And these worldviews, they take the beautiful, the true, and the good, and they concretize them into, specific cultural goals, like the environment or, America or freedom or liberty. In other words, the different worldviews have different conceptions of what's beautiful, true, and good. Even though they may overlap, they also conflict and are dialectically in conflict, right? That's part of what's causing the culture war. But even though values may not be, especially the more specific you get, the less agreeable they become cross-culturally, virtues, especially when they're, the 7 chosen virtues that relate to greater than self-interest and self-interest, these are universal. Every worldview can appreciate virtues. Like postmodernism originally rejected virtues in their effort to become liberated, right? They didn't want the sort of Christian ideas of temperance or prudence to be overlaid on their, liberation in the 60s and all the excess that went with that. But now I think there are in postmodern circles, especially in academia, there are philosophers who are beginning to recognize that these aren't just, again, religious commandments. They're deeply connected to what it means to live a good life and be happy, right? So virtues are something that can be a basis of solidarity in our culture if we can develop a virtues culture. And we're not going to get everybody to care about virtues, but if we could develop a subculture in the same way that we've, over the past several decades, we've developed a natural foods culture, right? Not everybody eats natural foods, but thousands and thousands more people every day are turned on to the benefits of natural foods, how it makes their body healthier, how it makes them feel better, right? And so it's trickled down through the society so that I don't know, you could say that maybe not the center of gravity, but certainly a major part of American society is eating more healthy than they did 20 years ago. And that's an example of how a culture of physical health can uplift the culture. Right. So a virtues culture is similar. If we can develop a virtues culture and make people have, just like you have an expectation if you're postmodern that you're going to eat natural foods and you're going to live a healthy lifestyle, it's a cultural norm. If we can have a cultural norm that being virtuous, however you may define that, right? Again, there's not a set list of 7 virtues, but there are virtues. And if you can commit to 7 of them and practice them and compare and contrast with your friends and family who are also in a virtues practice, that begins to create a virtues culture, which can be a solidifying, a solidarity building influence in an otherwise hyper-polarized, society. And again, I go into how this virtue practice, because of its connection to self-interest, has all the elements necessary to help it become as popular as the practice of mindfulness. Right? Mindfulness is an ancient spiritual practice, but many people in the corporate world undertake it because it helps make them calm and more effective and less stressed out. They do it for personal reasons. Well, virtues similarly can be done for personal reasons like mindfulness, and some even suggest that the 2 practices can be combined, right? So being in the present moment with mindfulness, and then either before or after checking in with the 7 virtues you choose to live by, or your 10 virtues, or whatever virtue list you tend to want to commit to. Another way that the political implications of a building of virtues culture can make a difference is when we begin to understand the philosophy of virtues and what they mean, right? So, for example, Aristotelian understanding of virtue as a mean between extremes, and how that all virtues are in a sense connected to each other. We can see how postmodernism, if it were to more adopt or popularize within its cultural discourse a culture of virtues, that it would make them more effective. So to be specific, right, a big focus of postmodern value concern is social justice and environmental justice. Justice, right, is one of the big things that postmodernists are striving for. But part of the reason that social justice and environmental justice aren't being as politically effective as they otherwise could be is because the postmodern concept of justice is not virtuous enough. In other words, the justice that they demand, it's militant, it's angry, right? And again, there's good reasons to be angry about the need for environmental justice and social justice. You want to have a certain amount of righteousness. That's a virtue in itself. But obviously, when you understand justice, the concept of justice, not just as a value, but as a virtue, you can begin to see how justice as a virtue is focused on redemption. It's informed by forgiveness and love, right? That is, justice when it's held together with the other virtues becomes more virtuous by virtue of its connection, and it's influenced by these others. And so if the postmodern concept of justice were to become more virtuous, it would become more attractive. And so the programs that postmodernists pursue for social justice and environmental justice would be more effective at persuading the rest of the society, because their concept of justice would be more attractive, more spiritually fragrant, more charged with the value energy that it needs to persuade and succeed politically.
Well, I appreciate how you have laid out a polarity between gratitude and grievance, and that, as you told me more than a few times, that the postmodernists are polarized on the grievance side. And one of the ways to make it more attractive is to bring on the gratitude.
Well, again, the charge of the value-creating capacity of a political grievance, right, or a protest, that when you understand this technology of value energy, and you see that these polarities, that any value, almost every value-creating practice or concept or idea is connected to another value-creating concept or ideal that's in tension with it, that it's interdependent, that there's a relationship of challenge and support, right? So gratitude can support grievance, but it can also challenge grievance, right? So we're in this society where, if you have a grievance in China, they put you in jail, right? If you have a grievance in the United States, you get on TV, right? So grievance creates value only in the context of this larger free society, and a degree of gratitude for those freedoms and the sort of the context in which we can work to make the world a better place, that these things work together. Likewise, gratitude by itself can become pathological, kind of jingoistic patriotism, right? We don't want to accept things as they are. I'm not arguing for the status quo, but an integral perspective makes us see that we can't just wipe away the status quo. We have to build on it, right? So we don't want to be satisfied with it, but we don't want to completely reject it. We want to do what evolution does, and that is transcend and include. Transcend and include.
Right.
And that's what this philosophy of virtues and this practice of virtues and this culture of virtues that we're trying to create as a new component of integral philosophy and the program of developmental politics. That's how it can make a difference and relate to real world problems.
Yeah. Well, right on, Steve. And like I said, it has made a surprising impact on my life. And, to ponder faith, love, justice, temperance, hope, courage, and prudence is, it's just, I feel like I'm plugging into something.
Right. You don't have to accept those, somewhat stodgy terms, prudence,
I like it. I like prudence.
Self-mastery, right? I mean, that's way more modern, right? Or practical wisdom. Again, if you go, each one of those 7 fundamental virtues has 7 other choices or 6 other choices that go with it. But those other choices are derived from that which you owe to yourself. that which you owe to others, that which you owe to what's greater than yourself. And so you can begin to see the system and appreciate it as a system. And the philosophy, the philosophical explanation of how I kind of discovered this practice of virtues and this exercise to kickstart people's virtue practice and get them to think about virtues, which is really the main part of the practice. Is just they're, again, like I said, they're states of intention, habits of the heart, and those habits are formed by committing and recommitting and remembering and being tested. Being afraid and remembering that you've committed to the virtue of courage, right? Being in doubt or having a nihilistic feeling and remember that you've committed to the virtue of faith.
Yes.
That you're going to have faith, that that's a way of tapping into the value energy of the universe. There's really something to it. And that's why the exercise works. That's why we've already had, we just launched it a few days ago. We've had hundreds of people take it already. And
that's fantastic.
Yeah. And so
and people can find it at culturalevolution.org.
Culturalevolution.org, the website of the Institute for Cultural Evolution, and you'll see it in the menu and you'll see it in the first slider. So you can't miss it if you just go to culturalevolution.org. It only takes between 7 and 14 minutes. I mean, you can sit and contemplate, and that's worthwhile. I mean, the longer you take, the more effective the exercise. But you can also do it quickly. It's 10 questions. It's not a giant commitment of time. And you just play around with it. And you can do it multiple times. You get your chart exactly like you want it. And then put it on your refrigerator. Print it out.
I did.
And having it in your personal space, being keeping it in mind, going through life with it, living with it. This is a powerful spiritual practice, which is newly emerging. And I think that the perspective of integral philosophy on this practice brings it alive at a new level. So I encourage people to check it out.
Yeah. Well, I thank you very much, Steve McIntosh, for your work, and we're looking forward to the book, Developmental Politics.
We'll be discussing lots more about these other technologies of value energy, these other methods for tapping into the upward current of the good and the philosophy behind that. I kind of try to land as much as I could in this talk, but there's much more to unpack and a lot of interesting things.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve McIntosh. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Daily Evolver. See you next time.